All right, it's looking like we have a good number of people that have joined us this evening. I don't know, John, if you want to take the reins now and do your introduction, and then we can go from there.
Definitely. Thank you, Katie. Hopefully everyone can see me okay. I do want to apologize. I am calling in from a car, as we sometimes have to do. But hopefully you can all hear me well and hear everything I say. So first of all, I want to just thank everyone for joining us this evening. This is a public meeting regarding a National Historic District for our neighborhood for Wallingford. We know that it's 7 o'clock. It's kind of dinner time for a lot of people. So we are going to try to keep it on point. And we welcome your questions more towards the end of the presentation. My name is John Bredesen. I'm part of Wallingford, historic Wallingford, and have lived in the neighborhood now for about 20 years. I've rented all around Seattle, and I am a native of the area. We want to thank the many people in the neighborhood for their support, and definitely want to call out For Culture, an organization within the city that has been very supportive of historic Wallingford. Wallingford has one of the largest collections of early 20th century residential architecture in Seattle, especially the arts and crafts movement, so important in America. I love to tell the story. Very often when I was on I-5 as a child, passing through the city, I would point down to the Wallingford district and tell my dad, what's that area? It looks so great and so interesting. And he would always tell me, oh, John, you don't want to live there. That's, a very blue collar place. It's not an interesting neighborhood at all. You want to look at other parts of the city or the east side, he would say. And when I initially moved into the Wallingford area, I thought I would maybe be there for 5 or 6 years and maybe move to another neighborhood. And I fell in love with it. I fell in love with the architecture. And I fell in love with the neighborhood and the culture of it itself. The craftsman that we live in today was a rental, and we have tried to restore it as much as we can, including a basement, which we've turned into an ADU. And it also used to be a speakeasy. So I think the history is very rich in the neighborhood, which we love. A little bit about Historic Wallingford. We are the host of this event. It's an all-volunteer organization formed in 2017. We carry out different activities such as walking tours, workshops, events. We really want to help raise awareness and appreciation of the history and the architecture in Wallingford. And in line with this mission, last year we launched a research for a National Register Historic District. You will learn this evening the purpose of such a district and how it is an educational tool to promote the history and sense of place in the area that we enjoy, known as Wallingford. Looking into the future, we see Historic Wallingford continuing to offer experiences, educational information regarding the architecture and history, and we hope to advocate for Wallingford by supporting the premise of UW Professor Catherine Rogers Merlino, which is to promote the historic fabric of the neighborhood and work to accommodate growth with additional dwelling units that can blend in with existing heritage homes without tearing all of them down. Developing a National Historic Register is hard work, and it takes a lot of time and effort, a lot of support. We hope to be able to nominate areas within Wallingford in the future, but we need additional leadership and support to make that happen. Currently, with the needs of growth in this city, Historic Wallingford has no plans to seek a City of Seattle landmark or a conservation district. We are holding this public meeting to share with you the workings of the National Register Historic District nomination and what we expect the next steps to be. A second public meeting will be held at the conclusion of the nomination report, writing, and process. The historic district process started with a feasibility study conducted in the summer of 2019 by the volunteers organized by Historic Wallingford and led by the professional preservation consultants, Northwest Vernacular. The study identified 4 areas in Wallingford that are potentially eligible as National Register Historic Districts. The report is on our website, historicwallingford.org. We opted to begin research in areas with the highest concentration of older, intact properties for a National Register historic district. As part of this research, our volunteers collected information about the people who lived in Wallingford, including their origin and occupations from roughly 1900 to 1940. A picture is emerging of what life was like in this working class neighborhood during the early 20th century when much of the neighborhood was developed. This development was driven by such activities as the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition, trolley line expansion into the suburbs of Seattle, and industrial development on the north shore of Lake Union. The culmination of this project will be a rich document that anyone can access to better understand the history of the neighborhood, buildings, and residents who lived there. I want to thank you again for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Spencer Howard and Katie Pratt from Northwest Vernacular, and they'll give you information on the nomination and discuss some of their findings so far. Great.
Wonderful.
Katie, Spencer?
I'll pick it up from here. Thank you, John. Thank you for that introduction. And so we've got a lot of material to cover. I'll go through some of the process and methodology at the beginning and turn it over to Katie Pratt to talk about the initial analysis that we're doing on the census data research. And then I'll pick it back up again to talk about next steps and what the next steps in the process are going to be. So a couple items. Please note that we are recording this meeting and that just a reminder to the panelists to please keep your video turned off except when presenting or speaking. So with that, welcome to the first of the 2 public meetings. So the goal of this meeting, as John shared, is to really try and get more of the information out and the analysis from the census data. We will also address questions specific to the presentation at the end. We'll do that through the question and answer mechanism within Zoom. So if anyone has questions as we're going along, please type them into the question and answer dialog box. Those will show up to us and we'll go through and be able to review those. And then at the end, we'll have time to be able to go through and answer those questions specific to the presentation. So to start with, we would like to acknowledge the proposed historic district is on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. The project is sponsored by Historic Wallingford. Historic Wallingford received a For-Culture Preservation Special Projects grant to support the broader demographic analysis and informational maps drawing on census records from 1910 through 1940. Funding for the National Register nomination preparation also comes from Historic Wallingford. And as John mentioned, this really would not have been possible without the countless hours spent by volunteers conducting field work, setting up and maintaining the project database, conducting archival research, and digitizing the census records. So the Wallingford Historic District Feasibility Study, as John mentioned, provided the groundwork for subsequent research. This is just kind of to provide a visual to what John was talking about. The map at left shows the overall area reviewed during the feasibility study with the recommended potential historic districts shown with dashed lines. The overall area boundary shown with the solid line stemmed from the neighborhood inventory completed in 1976 for Wallingford. And so identification of the areas started with looking at the underlying plats, followed by field work to evaluate the extent of alterations and the use of estimated year-built data from King County. Once we had an idea on integrity and how that related to the underlying plats, we consulted with the State Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, STAP, to help review our findings and provide initial guidance on how to define potential district boundaries. And so Historic Wallingford, based on input from DAP, the public, and a working group of volunteers, opted to first pursue the historic district designation for study areas A and D, shown in the map at left. The map at right shows the same area as well as ongoing boundary refinements along the south edge based on fieldwork and research. And so the general boundaries of the area that we're going to be talking about in this presentation are Northeast 50th Street along the north, 5th Avenue Northeast on the east, Northeast 46th Street along the south, and Interlake Avenue North along the west. So the proposed historic district spans multiple plats dating from 1888 through 1922. Our work in preparing the National Register District nomination has been to understand the patterns of development, what shaped them, who lived in the buildings, and how this is communicated through the area's architecture. Census records have been a key tool in understanding who lived in the buildings and what they did. So the census records help us to understand architecture as a defining characteristic of the neighborhood through how it was used. Used in conjunction with Sanborn fire insurance maps, zoning maps, and redlining maps, the data helps us to understand the effects of restrictive city land use and nationwide banking policies. So the enumeration district cards, ED cards, with an example shown at right, provide a written record of who lived in each building, along with such information as tenure, household size, occupation, and place of birth. The yellow highlighted line corresponds to the 4646 house, and the blue lines to the 4650 house shown at left. We pulled these cards from 1910, 1920, 1930, and 1940, and then volunteers typed up this handwritten data into Excel files for each decade. So this and the next three slides illustrate the extent of development at each decade and the enumeration district card data projected data projected spatially by address within the area. The upper left map consists of a 1905 Sanborn fire insurance maps overlaid on a 2019 King County aerial. Despite the underlying 1888 and 1889 plats in the west portion of the area, very little development had occurred by 1905. Development accelerated between 1905 and 1910, with the lower left map showing extant buildings built by 1910 based on King County assessor estimated dates of construction. And so the upper right map shows a point location for each of the 203 heads of household recorded in the 1910 census area. Each point contains the data extracted from the enumeration district cards, including tenure, occupation, and household size. So based on the census data, we knew that over 780 people lived in the area in 1910. Note too that in comparing the upper right corner of the buildings and the point data maps, that the data does not always align perfectly. This could be due to estimated dates of construction being off for the buildings, or houses having been built but vacant when the census was conducted. So for 1920, the upper left map consists of the 1919 fire insurance maps overlaid on a 2019 King County aerial. Development by 1919 was really widespread throughout the area. The lower left map shows extant buildings built by 1920 based on the King County assessor estimated dates of construction. The upper right map shows the point location for each of the 472 heads of household recorded in the 1920 census for the area. Based on the census data, we knew that the population had increased to a little over 1,850 people in the area. So for 1930, the upper left map is again the 1919 Sanborn fire insurance maps. It didn't have an update that occurred closer to 1930, overlaid on a 2019 King County aerial. The lower left map again shows buildings that exist today that were built by 1930 based on King County assessor data. And then the upper right map shows the point location for each of the 731 heads of household recorded in the 1930 census. And again, the population increased. We knew at that time that based on the census data that there were 2,760, or over 2,760 people living in the area. And 1940, so again, the upper, actually on this one, the upper left map consists of 1946 Sanborn Fire Insurance maps overlaid on a 2019 King County aerial. So this was an update that occurred a little bit after the 1940 census. The lower left map shows extant buildings built by 1940 based on King County assessor data. And the upper right map shows a point location for each of the census, 744 heads of household recorded in the 1940 census. And based on the census data, we know that over 2,400 people lived in the area. So that's kind of an idea of the data sets that have been collected through the census research and how we're tying these data sets to the physical resources that existed and used to exist within the area to better extrapolate out how they changed over time, who lived in them, what density was like, and more of the details that aren't necessarily always readily apparent just by looking at the buildings. Zoning and exclusionary practices had a profound impact on the city and the proposed National Register historic area. We know residents in each of the census decades from 1910 through 1940 were majority white. The upper right map shows an excerpt from the Mapping Inequality, Redlining in New Deal America study that documents exclusionary lending practices. The federal government's Homeowners Loan Corporation between 1935 and 1940, in determining which areas of the city should receive loans, graded this area as still desirable. A key factor in determining this grading were the economic class of residents and their racial and ethnic identity. Although these redlining practices were exposed in 1938, they remained in place, affecting lending practices for another 30 years until the Fair Housing Act of 1968 formally made racial segregation in housing illegal. The two maps at left are city zoning maps with the proposed historic district boundary overlaid. The upper 1923 map shows the 1923 zoning establishing much of the area as first residence district, with the business district mostly along 45th. We also know that 78% of the extant buildings in the area were built prior to this zoning. There was also multiple apartment buildings built in the 1920s, just prior to the Great Depression, within what had been established as the first residence district in the area that in 1957 became the multiple residence low density zone. So we're working now to understand the processes that shape these patterns and what they communicate. And so with that, I'll now turn the presentation over to Katie Pratt to talk about the census analysis.
Thank you, Spencer. So as Spencer mentioned, with the help of numerous volunteers, the census records from 1910, 20, 30, and 40 were digitized for the proposed historic district, and we're starting our analysis based on a number of items. So this information is helpful for understanding who lived in the area during these years, but it's also limited since it doesn't capture anything in the years between the census gatherings. And also as a note, Spencer mentioned the enumeration district cards as where we obtained this data. So in case you don't know, the US government will not release personally identifiable information about an individual to any other individual or agency until 72 years after it was collected for the census. So while we can access general census tract level information for more recent years, 1950 and on, the granular level data, household by household, is only available in these cards. And the National Archives releases them 72 years after the date of the census. So 1950 will be available next year. So that's just to explain why we're really only talking about 1910 through 1940. It's not that we're not going to continue to look at the history of the neighborhood, but we've still been working on analyzing all of this information that is available to us with the enumeration district cards. In the next series of slides, we will look at household size, tenure, industry, trade, place of birth, women, lodgers, and multiple households for each of the census decades. Each is just a snapshot in time, And we have not yet looked at how these historic patterns relate to current conditions. So we're still working on this. This is a lot of research to compile, and we're still making steps forward. So just to keep that in mind, we're just kind of letting you know where we're at in the process. Next slide, Spencer. Household size is the number of building occupants associated with each head of household. This data is grouped by head of household, as often houses, and especially flats and apartments, had multiple heads of household. These maps on your screen show 1910 and 1920, and they show the increase in number of households, but also in size as the area's population just more than doubled from 780 to over 1,850 in those 10 years. Notable for both decades is that larger households, often with extended family or multiple generations, comprise nearly 30% of the households. Next slide. During the next 2 census decades, household sizes decreased. So while the middle range of 3 to 4 people, what we might assume would be the nuclear family, remained relatively consistent with the previous 2 decades, the larger household sizes dropped in each decade, and the 1 to 2 people household size increased. This does in part reflect that multiple apartment buildings completed in the late 1920s that were counted as part of both of those decades. So maybe one person was living in a unit, so they were one head of household. Apartment construction really did allow for greater independence for people who would likely have continued to live at home with their families or as boarders to have their own residence, and they were thus marked as heads of household in the census. Next slide. Tenure is whether the head of household owned or rented the building. During the 1910 and 1920 census, the pattern was majority ownership. Although the population more than doubled between these 2 decades, and the 1920 census identified more instances of 2 or more households per house, the rate of new single-family housing construction resulted in an increase in ownership numbers. You can just see that on the lower map, just how many more squares there are because there's just so many more houses constructed within the neighborhood. Next slide. The percentage of renters climbed during the 1930 and 1940 census decades, with renters comprising 33% in 1930 of the area's residents and 40% in 1940. As we mentioned before, the construction of multiple apartment buildings at the end of the 1920s accounted for part of this shift, with some of the larger buildings having 19 units each. You can see the maps, on the maps, the clusters of pinkish triangles, and that's where the apartment buildings were constructed. So there's one building, but lots of triangles on top of it to indicate that it's an apartment building. There were also changes with single family houses, with some that were owner occupied in 1930, but then were renter occupied in 1940. And as we move forward, we will compare these numbers to citywide patterns and the larger Wallingford neighborhood to determine if this does or does not align with larger trends. Next slide. Industry is the broad occupational groupings for heads of household based on their trade and area of work identified in the enumeration district cards. We wanted to understand how people living in the area were employed and how this relates to the city's overall development patterns. We organized all the heads of household into the categories identified in the lower right of the slide, and out of these, the major areas of employment were commerce, industry, and transportation. Other industries were government, which included fire, postal, police workers, education, like teachers and professors, religion, which makes sense given the House of Good Shepherd, funerary, defense, healthcare, recreation, and culture, and subsistence. Commerce was the main area of employment and included office workers, salespeople, professionals like accountants, architects, engineers, as well as specialty business workers like bakers and tailors and butchers. Industry in 1910 consisted mostly of tradespeople such as painters, carpenters, and bricklayers, as well as people working in manufacturing and in extraction like logging or mining. By 1920, this had diversified to include the maritime industry as well as the energy sector. And transportation in both decades remained generally split between rail, road, and water-related work. Next slide. Major employment areas remained consistent in 1930 relative to previous 1910 and 1920 patterns. Industry did expand in 1930 to include just one head of household who was employed in the aviation industry, and then that grew to just 6 in 1940, which is somewhat reflective of the industry growing in Seattle, perhaps. So while commerce, industry, and transportation remained the 3 largest industries for residents in 1940, there were notable increases in subsistence, defense, government, and education. Next slide. Trade refers to the specific occupation of the head of household. And so this is only just because of the capabilities of mapping is only referring to heads of household and isn't necessarily reflective of households that had multiple workers, say a spouse worked or a live-in, like a brother-in-law or other family member that had a job as well. So it's just heads of household. These are recorded for each, and along with other data collected will be included in the significant summary for each building. Within the National Register district nomination, each property within the district boundaries has a short description of its physical appearance, as well as a significant statement, which is where this information will get outlined. So someone could, when we're done with the nomination, you'd be able to look up your house and you would have this information all there for you to know who previously had lived in your house and what they had done for work. We've included them here as labels to the points just to illustrate the range of occupations of the area's past residents. I know personally, I enjoy seeing all the different types of occupations people had, because some people still do today, and also there are occupations that have really become obsolete, or there are fewer individuals who possess those skills, particularly when we look at work in the trades. Next slide. And this just carries that same information forward from 1930 and 1940. Next slide. So birth refers to the place of birth for the head of household. Throughout all 4 census decades, the percentage of residents born in either the United States or Canada remained consistent at just over 75%. Northern and Western Europe, including Scandinavian countries and Great Britain, were the next major group within the area, and those are shown with the yellow dots. The households with the head of household born in Syria is shown with blue diamonds, and that was just unique and remained consistent throughout 4 decades, all 4 decades. So we just wanted to highlight it because it was different from the rest of the neighborhood demographics. Next slide. The 1930 census brought an increase in countries of birth, including from Malta, China, and Eastern Europe. But again, the United States, Canada, and Northwestern Europe remained the primary countries of origin for residents in the area. Next slide. These maps refer to women who were identified as heads of household in the census. None were recorded for the 1910 census, but by 1920, there was a significant number, but that dropped with the 1930 census. Next slide. And then the 1940 census had an increase in women as heads of household, and we're still working to understand what this means in the context of the areas and cities' development patterns. Next slide. Lodgers are people or a person renting living space in a building and are not the primary occupant of the building. The 1920 census data identified 45 lodgers, and the point sizes on the maps correspond to the number of lodgers in the building. And then on the 1930 map, the number of lodgers went up to 66. Next slide. And in 1940, it went back down and there were only 30 lodgers. Next slide. So although the area was majority single family use, multiple households were an aspect of the neighborhood identified through the census data. This included what could have been accessory dwelling units and detached accessory dwelling units in at least 6% of the houses. So the upper map identified in dark blue are the single family houses that had either an ADU or a DADU. And by ADU, we can't say that it was necessarily a separate dwelling of what we consider an ADU today with its own kitchen and bath, but it indicates that it wasn't just an extended family or multiple generation household, so that one address had two heads of household at least, and they weren't necessarily or easily identified as related. Because the census data in those enumeration district cards that we've been talking about, they identify the relationship of each individual to the head of household. So it would say who the spouse is, if they had any children, if their brother or their mother-in-law lived with them, or a boarder. And the DADU means that the census lists a half address, like there's a 901 and a 901 and a half, but there's only one actual house on the property at 901. So that indicates that there may have been a detached accessory dwelling unit. The apartment buildings on that upper map are shown in green, and the one mixed use building is shown in tan. So we're still working through the census and archival data to identify which of the garages shown above on the lower map in red may have functioned historically as detached accessory dwelling units. We're not sure, but we have the data and are trying to figure out where it connects and if it connects with the built environment that was either there or is still there today. Next slide. Since the objective of this project is a National Register Historic District listing, we wanted to talk through the differences between a Seattle Landmark District and a National Register District. We also wanted to highlight what we believe to be the community benefit to National Register designation. So this slide provides a list of frequently asked questions about what it means to be in a National Register District, and then compares it with the Seattle Landmark District, because they really are, despite the terminology being so similar and often, interchangeable, they're different processes. So listing to the National Register is honorary and design review is not required. Conversely, National Register listing does not protect buildings or a district as a whole from demolition. The community value stems from understanding the role of the area within Seattle's past, as well as understanding previous building residents. Listing enables recognition of both the positive and negative aspects of the area's architectural and heritage. And we hope that it ultimately fosters a better understanding of past development patterns and the role of restrictive policies in zoning and shaping the area. Next slide. So now I'm briefly going to talk about incentives that are available for properties that are National Register listed, in particular special valuation and the federal tax credits. Next slide. So there are a few incentives available for historic resources. Special valuation is a Washington state program, and it is a property tax reduction benefit tied to work done on buildings. And it does require design review, but you only have the design review if you choose to participate in the program. And the table on your screen outlines who is eligible for that and what is required in that sense. The federal tax credits are also tied to work done specifically on commercial buildings, and they require design review. Basically, the idea is if you're going to get a tax incentive, you're going to have design review to ensure that it aligns with the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. But if you're not trying to get the tax incentive, then you don't have to worry about the design review for National Register listed properties. The Savinsky grant with the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation and For Culture's Preservation Special Project grants are also available to community groups, which can help support planning, educational, and interpretive efforts. I just wanted to quickly highlight the special valuation program because that's really a key program that is available to non-income producing residential properties. It was established in 1985 by the state legislature and allows a special valuation for historic properties within the state, or certain historic properties within the state. It has to be identified by the certified local government. The primary benefit of this program is that during the 10-year special valuation period, property taxes will not reflect substantial improvements made to properties that are eligible for special valuation. So if a property owner incurs qualified rehabilitation costs that equal at least 25% of the building's assessed value, not the building and land, just the building, within a 24-month period prior to application, those qualified costs can be subtracted from the newly assessed value of the property for 10 years. The intent of this legislation was to take away the disincentive of increased property taxes that was created when a property owner substantially improved a property. So this is a potential individual benefit for historic property owners, but we believe there's also a community benefit to National Register designation. First of all, the process of researching and documenting the neighborhood identifies its history, both positive and negative, which helps residents understand how and why their neighborhood developed. We also believe that supporting historic neighborhoods and their building stock encourages communities to retain and reuse their existing resources in established neighborhoods. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Spencer for him to talk about what's next.
Thank you, Katie. So we have a series of next steps as part of nominating the National Register Historic District. The final submittal date to the State Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation will be in December of 2021. We are hoping, depending on edits, to get on the agenda for the March 2022 Washington Advisory Council on Historic Preservation meeting. This would put National Park Service review and potential listing by fall or winter of 2022. So that's kind of where we're going and hoping. We've got a lot to do between now and the first DAP submittal in November. As we're going along, if you have any questions and if you want to check in for updates and just kind of see what's going on, I would really encourage you to visit historicwallingford.org. It's a great source for updates and additional resources and information. And with that, we have some closing remarks from Rhonda with Historic Wallingford, and then we'll go into the question and answer period. Rhonda?
Am I here?
Yes,
hello?
You are.
Okay.
You are.
I'm not visible. Well, my remarks were for the end, but I'll go ahead and say them. But thank you so much for all of you involved for participating this evening. And we so appreciate your support for Historic Wallingford and look forward to more activities with those of you who love and cherish this community. And thank you to the volunteers who have worked very hard on the research for this nomination, and to Historic Wallingford board members who extend themselves in many ways for this effort. And again, we thank For Culture, which is the King County Arts and Preservation Organization, and Historic Seattle. Both organizations have been supportive of Historic Wallingford as we were founded and continue to develop. So finally, one of our friends reached out this week and asked that we remind people to vote on November 2nd. So I agree, let's do vote. Anyway, thank you. And now let's ask questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rhonda. Let's see, we're just checking, looking through the questions that have been coming in.
I can answer the first one that popped up, Spencer.
Wonderful.
We had a question. In the beginning, it was noted how Wallingford was historically a blue-collar working class neighborhood. Is that still true? What's the average income in the neighborhood now? And what is the median house price? I also like that you ended it with thank you, cheers. So thank you so much. We are still working through all of the data. So that is a great question. And I think we're hoping to be able to track the trend as close as possible up to the future. It is limited in the sense that we have the enumeration districts that cards through 1940. So we have all that really individual granular level detail for every property within the district that was constructed 1940 and before. But we have the more general census tract information. So we'll be able, won't be as specific to the boundaries that we're looking at, but we will be carrying that forward and be able to talk more about how the neighborhood has likely changed over time and how it may be different from its historic roots. So while I don't have the answer specifically for that today, that is something that we are hoping to be able to answer and will include in the draft nomination that we carry forward. So thank you for that.
Great, thank you, Katie. I can answer the next question. Sort of question about home styles and the thoughts that a lot of the styles that are of the buildings within what the area that we're studying for the National Register Historic District are represented in national catalogs, national design movements, and can also be found in most every city in the United States. And so what allows this neighborhood to illustrate anything about a unique style to this neighborhood or something that deserves national recognition? And so to that end, we've been with the volunteers, they've been working on field work, going through and surveying all of the buildings within the proposed historic district. And we've been identifying the architectural styles for all of these buildings. And then we've been looking at how they were implemented. We've also been looking for information on builders and architects to better understand the patterns and how they developed. The other part too is that in looking at this, it is the National Register, but part of it is also looking at the local level of significance and how the architecture in this neighborhood is characteristic and significant to the neighborhood. And an important part of that has been the census data to try and understand how those two connect, the people that lived in the neighborhood and the architecture. And so we're still working on that. And that's something that we'll have in the draft National Register nomination. Thank you.
Oh, Spencer, I also wanted to add to that one that on the Historic Wallingford website, Spencer and we have a preservation consulting business and our name is Northwest Vernacular. So sometimes that can be confusing when it's being discussed on the webpage, but that's our business name is Northwest Vernacular. And it's also discussion of architecture, but in this instance, it's most likely referring to our business.
Great, thank you, Katie.
Great, and Spencer, I can take the next question from Molly, if you'd like.
Yes, please.
Hi, so my name is Sarah Martin and I serve with Historic Wallingford. And I just want to answer the question from Molly. She said this was a very detailed presentation. Are there other community engagement activities that you are working on to promote education around these findings? And thanks, Molly, for your comment and your question. Yeah, we're really excited about kind of the information that's coming out of all the research we're doing for this activity. And I think we've got enough material, I think, for several years worth of educational activities, walking tours, and sort of web-based educational activities. And to your point, though, I think we are planning first of all, a second public meeting is coming up in sort of late November, early December. It's not yet posted, but we do want to kind of relay a few more of the findings and the final application to really share with the neighborhood. And then going forward, I think we do want to have public activities. The pandemic has been a little bit of a challenge getting together for activities and community engagement, but we do hope to share more of the findings through small group interactions and hopefully in-person activities in 2022 for sure. Thanks, Molly.
Thank you, Sarah. So we've got another question that is, which goals of Historic Wallingford cannot be achieved except through Historic District designation, which works to achieve preservation of the current built environment. And I think that, that especially with John's introduction and opening statement is that Historic Wallingford is not seeking a city landmark district, that we're seeking a National Register historic district. And the intent of this and the goals that are being achieved is to document the built environment, document the social history, its role within Seattle, and basically be able to have a record of that for people who live in the neighborhood, for other neighborhoods to kind of look at and understand how different neighborhoods relate and developed over time. So it's not something that necessarily, as Katie pointed out in the differences between local and National Register, it does not stop demolition of properties, but it raises awareness for the history, both the good and bad, of the neighborhood.
Okay, this is Katie again, and I'm going to answer a question posed by Matt. He asks, can you please clarify what criteria you will be arguing that this district meets in order to qualify for National Register listing? Architectural significance is the most common criterion for listing, but you have mentioned architecture only very briefly in this presentation. Yes, that's a great point, Matt. So for listing to the National Register of Historic Places, there are 4 criteria for evaluation. So you list, it has to be eligible under at least one criterion, but it can be eligible under multiple. Those are A, B, C, and D. A is for its association with an event or kind of patterns of history. B is association with someone significant. C is that it represents a method, period, or type of construction, or is a work of a master. So sometimes that's seen as, oh, it has to be the best example of an architectural style, but it can also just be a good representation of a period of construction. And then D is that it can convey information. It has the ability to convey information about history. That one's often used for archaeology. So we're still developing the criteria that we think that we're using. We have an idea that it will be A and C. So patterns of history like streetcar development, suburb development, and then patterns of construction within the neighborhood. But we're still compiling the research, and I like to write that significant statement at the very end after I've done all the research and writing, and see what is supported by the research and documentation that we've done. But thank you, that's a great question, and we'll have more of that information at the next meeting once we have the draft document.
Great, thank you, Katie. We've got another question that, so if residents of Wallingford oppose the designation, what is the process to object to the National Register designation process? And so because the National Register listing process does not impose any restrictions on property usage, limitations, design review, etc., the onus is placed on people who object. And so they, and we'll provide additional information on this at the second public meeting, but they have to submit a notarized letter of objection to the State Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, objecting to the proposed historic district, National Register Historic District. And we have a follow-up question too of what percentage of these homes are not kit homes or generic designs? What's unique about the architecture of the neighborhood versus others? And yeah, that's a fantastic question. And that is what we're working on trying to be able to answer and figuring that out. And that will ultimately relate to the criteria that we put the district forward for eligibility consideration. And it's part of why we're having the volunteers look at the properties in the field and why we're doing the census and the background research, is to try and bring all of that together to understand what is unique and significant about this area. And at this point, we don't have a good definitive answer to that. We're still too early in the research and draft stage for that.
Spencer, I'd like to follow up on, this is Sarah, on Jocelyn's comment. Jocelyn is one of our board members. She wanted me to share with folks to continue to follow this process. We are posting on Instagram and Facebook and on our monthly newsletters that come out, updates, not only updates on the process, but just kind of interesting history facts that we're compiling as part of the application process. So little feature stories we're publishing in our monthly newsletters and posting on the website, and of course then sharing out on Instagram and Facebook. So be sure to track us down in those locations. You can sign up for our newsletter on our website, historicwallingford.org.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So we've got another question. Would putting the area on the National Register affect any future rezoning? And that policy and procedurally wise, not directly. That's really up to the city and how they treat different designated areas and what their approach is for that. Typically, it's a local, a Seattle landmark district that has the demolition protections and design review. That's something that that's tied into preservation. And as we've tried to kind of remind on this, is that National Register is really an honorary designation, and it's not something that affects land use, demolition, or changes to the buildings. And we have another kind of similar question to that. Does historic preservation include any rollback of or changes to zones? And that's similar to the question before, is that, again, it's not tied to zoning. It's not tied to demolition, preservation, or really to protecting the physical. It's trying to raise awareness and to be able to document the history of the neighborhood and its development.
Okay, so I have a question that for Brian. So you described documenting the built environment and the area. As a homeowner in Area D, I find the maps labeling built 1900 to 1936 as contributing and others as not a little off base. For example, there are lots of older homes that are not distinctive in any way, while other buildings like the Mary Dawn, the Serpentine, and Walling 5 apartments we experience as integral to the character of the area. Shouldn't we be focused on buildings rather than a whole area? That's a really great and interesting question, Brian. And I think it's in thinking about why a district can be beneficial is that it captures the history of a larger area, and by assigning contributing and non-contributing, it kind of does the work for the whole area in a more efficient way than having to go out and kind of cherry pick each property that's significant. And that contributing and non-contributing does some of that sorting out. And the date frame, and that's what we're still working to identify, is when you do a National Register historic district, you have to identify a period of significance. And it usually extends for a neighborhood. You go from kind of at least the oldest property that's existing within the district, and then you have to decide what that end date is. And so nothing that's built outside of that period of significance can be seen as contributing. So we're still trying to figure out kind of what those patterns and trends are so we can have a better idea, focusing in on this specific district, what that period of significance will be. But I would not say that focusing on individual buildings is bad. And I think if individuals wanted to pursue that, that would be fantastic. But this kind of allows, especially with all the volunteers that have been working to gather as much information on kind of the broader area as possible, so that these properties would then be able to benefit from financial incentives, because apartment buildings can also benefit from the historic tax credit program through the federal government. So that's how I would answer that. So thank you, Brian.
Great, and we have a question from Gina. This is a great question, Gina. She's asking if there are articles or stories that we have to share on our historic homes. Would we be interested in receiving these? And if so, how to share those? Yes, if you have stories or accounts or photographs of your historic house, please, we'd love to receive them. Our email address is info@historicwallingford.org. You can also catch us on social media, but the easiest way to do that is just zip us an email, info@historicwallingford.org, and we'd love to see them.
Great, wonderful. Thank you. Well, the questions have been wonderful, and we've been so excited to see so many people attend and be able to participate in this. And I would really like to encourage everybody to go to historicwallingford.org to be able to follow the process and updates and the timing for the next meeting. So thanks everyone for participating, and we will close out the meeting. So thank you.